The smoke above the battlefield twisted in the wind, carrying the smell of blood and burning metal. Soldiers from two alien factions clashed in the ruined valley, their weapons tearing the ground apart. The cries of the wounded echoed across the rocks, but one voice cut through the chaos more than the rest. It was not a scream for help, it was a cry of defiance. And it belonged to the rebel princess of the Vayari, her golden armor stained with deep red. Kalen, a human mercenary, had no reason to be there. He was hired for small escort jobs, not to stand in the middle of an alien civil war. Yet he found himself watching the princess fight, her every movement sharp and desperate. She was surrounded, her left arm dripping blood from a cut that ran down to her fingers. The enemies closed in, sensing her weakness. Kellen's instincts told him to leave, but something in her eyes stopped him from turning away. She stumbled back, her sword lowering for the first time. Her breathing was heavy, her armor cracked along the shoulder. The Vayari loyalists shouted insults, calling her a traitor to her own kind. Kalen understood none of their words, but he recognized the hatred in their tone. One of them raised a blade to finish her, and Kalen moved before he could think. His boots pounded the dirt, his rifle swinging up. The shot rang out, and the attacker fell before he reached her. The princess looked at him in shock. Her kind had no reason to trust humans, not after the wars of the last century. But Kalen stood between her and the next wave of enemies, his weapon ready. She said something in her language, her voice trembling but firm. He didn't understand, yet the meaning was clear. She didn't expect him to stay. He planted his feet anyway, as if the ground beneath him was the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. Blaster fire tore past him, forcing him to duck. He returned fire, his shots sharp and controlled. The enemy hesitated, unsure how to deal with the sudden human interference. The princess used the moment to push herself up, gripping her sword tighter. Together, without any plan, they fought side by side. Her strikes were swift, almost graceful despite her injury, and Kellen's cover fire kept the enemies from surrounding them. It was not victory, but it was survival, at least for now. A massive figure stepped forward from the enemy ranks, clad in heavy black armor. His weapon was a long curved blade humming with energy. The soldiers around him stepped back, giving him space. The princess stiffened, her face pale. Kalen realized this was no ordinary soldier. This was their champion, sent to crush her spirit in front of everyone. The giant pointed his blade at her, then at Kalen, as if declaring both of them his prey. The air seemed to grow heavier. Kellen's heart pounded, but he didn't move from her side. She glanced at him once, her alien eyes reflecting the flicker of flames around them. She whispered something softly, a word he didn't understand but felt deep in his chest. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was warning, but it gave him a strange sense of calm. If this giant wanted her, he would have to go through Kalen first. The champion charged, the ground shaking under his steps. Kalen braced himself, aiming for the gaps in the enemy's armor. The princess shifted her stance despite her wound, raising her sword once more. They were strangers from different worlds. Standing against an enemy neither could face alone. The battle roared around them, but in that moment, the war narrowed to just 3 figures on a blood-stained field. The giant's blade swung with terrifying speed, forcing Kalen to dive aside. Sparks exploded where the weapon struck the ground, cutting deep into the stone. The princess lunged at the opening, her sword slicing across the giant's armored side. The blow left only a shallow mark, but it made him turn his attention back to her. Kalen used the moment to fire a burst at the gaps in his back armor, each shot ringing loud in the chaos. The enemy roared and twisted toward him. Kalen rolled away from the follow-up strike, the force of the blow shattering the rock where he had been. The princess pressed her attack, her movements graceful but edged with urgency. She knew she could not hold this pace for long. Blood still ran down. Her arm and every swing of her sword seemed to cost her more strength. Kaelin saw it and moved to shield her, stepping into the giant's path. The two clashed, steel against steel, the impact rattling through Kellen's arms. He was strong, but the giant's sheer power pushed him back. The ground beneath his boots shifted, and he almost lost his footing. The princess shouted something sharp in her language, and Kaelin understood without knowing the words she was telling him to stay clear. But he shook his head and braced himself for another strike. A sudden blast from the battlefield's edge caught everyone's attention. Enemy troops were advancing again, their weapons aimed at the pair. Kaelin felt the ground vibrate under the march of dozens more soldiers. The princess's eyes darted to the enemy line, then back to the giant before them. They were running out of time, and if they stayed, they would be overwhelmed. Kaelin could see the decision forming in her mind. She feinted left, drawing the giant's blade with her, then spun toward Kaelin. Her hand caught his arm, pulling him with surprising strength. He resisted for half a second, unwilling to leave the fight, but then he saw the sheer number of enemies closing in. Survival came first. They moved together toward the jagged rocks at the battlefield's edge, the giant's footsteps thundering after them. Blaster fire rained down around them, searing the ground and filling the air with smoke. Kaelin pushed the princess ahead, keeping himself between her and the shots. They stumbled over rubble, the roar of the giant still behind them. The princess's breathing was ragged now, but her grip on her sword never loosened. She was a fighter, even when the odds turned impossible. They reached a narrow gap between two boulders. Kaelin forced her through first, then turned to fire at their pursuers. The giant's bulk made it hard for him to follow quickly, but his blade still sliced through the rock near Kellen's head. Shards of stone rained down, stinging his skin. He fired another burst, forcing the enemy to take cover. Then he slipped through the gap after her. Beyond the rocks was a steep slope leading down to a dry riverbed. They half ran, half slid to the bottom, dust rising in clouds around their boots. The sounds of pursuit were still close. Kaelin could hear the giant shouting orders in a deep, rumbling voice. The princess glanced back once, her face tense. She spoke to him quickly, her tone urgent. He caught one word he knew: safe. She was telling him where they had to go. A low ridge rose ahead, its surface littered with jagged shards of crystal that glimmered in the fading light. The princess pointed toward a narrow opening at its base. Kaelin didn't question it. They dashed for the gap, every muscle in his body burning from the effort. Behind them, the heavy steps of the giant drew nearer. They dove into the dark space just as the enemy reached the ridge, the sound of his blade striking stone echoing through the night. Inside the narrow opening, the air was cooler and carried the scent of minerals. The walls of the passage were lined with sharp crystal edges that caught the dim light and reflected it in fractured patterns. Kellen's breathing was heavy, and he could hear the princess's uneven steps just ahead. She was moving quickly, but her injury was slowing her. He caught up and saw fresh blood along the seam of her armor. Without a word, he reached into his pouch for a field bandage. The princess turned toward him, her eyes narrowing at first as if unsure of his intent. Then, seeing the bandage, she gave a small nod and allowed him to wrap her arm. The warmth of her skin surprised him, and he noticed the faint glow that pulsed under it. It was a reminder she was not human, but something far older and stranger. When he tied the last knot, she tested her arm with a short motion, and then moved forward again. Without speaking, the tunnel twisted downward, the floor crunching under their boots. Somewhere ahead, Kaelin heard the faint rush of water. The sound grew louder as they walked, masking the noise of their pursuers outside. Still, he could not shake the feeling that the giant would not give up so easily. He kept his rifle ready, his finger hovering near the trigger. The princess glanced back once, her face unreadable in the shifting light. The passage opened into a cavern where a thin stream flowed through the center. Strange plants clung to the walls, their leaves glowing faint green. The princess knelt and drank quickly, then gestured for Kalen to do the same. The water was cold and tasted metallic, but it eased the dryness in his throat. When he stood again, she was already scanning the walls for another exit. Her urgency told him this place was not safe to stay in for long. A distant noise echoed through the tunnel they had come from. It was faint, but Kalen recognized the rhythm of heavy boots. The giant had found the entrance. The princess's expression hardened, and she pointed toward a narrow ledge on the far side of the cavern. It was high, but a few jagged rocks looked climbable. Kalen moved first, testing each foothold before pulling himself up. The princess followed, her movements slower but precise. As they reached the top, Kalen extended his hand to help her over the final edge. She accepted it without hesitation, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no language between them, only the silent acknowledgement of shared survival. Then they moved on, entering another narrow path that sloped upward. The sound of the stream faded, replaced by the soft hum of wind through unseen cracks. The path grew steeper until it ended at a small opening to the outside. Kalen peered through and saw the landscape beyond dark hills under a red-tinged sky, with faint plumes of smoke on the horizon. The princess stepped up beside him and pointed toward the farthest ridge. Her voice was low but steady, and though he didn't understand the words, her tone carried certainty. That ridge was their destination. They emerged from the tunnel into the open air, the wind sharp against their faces. The ground was rough and scattered with shards of crystal that crunched under their steps. Kalen kept scanning the horizon for movement. Every shadow felt like it could hide an enemy. The princess moved with purpose, but her gaze often swept the terrain behind them. She was expecting the chase to resume at any moment, a sudden movement to their right made Kalen spin and raise his rifle. 3 figures in dark armor emerged from behind a cluster of rocks. These were scouts, faster and lighter than the giant, but just as dangerous. The princess shifted her grip on her sword, her body tensing. Kalen took aim at the first one, and the shot dropped him instantly. The others charged forward, their weapons raised. The fight was coming to them again, and there was no time to run. The first scout swung his blade toward Kalen, the edge humming with energy. Kalen sidestepped and fired a burst into the attacker's side. The armor cracked under the impact, and the scout collapsed. The second enemy closed in on the princess, moving with sharp, trained precision. She blocked the first strike, her sword ringing in the air, then twisted to counter. Her movement was slower than before, but her aim was true, and her blade cut across the scout's weapon arm. Kalen turned in time to see the third enemy coming at him from the side. He dropped low, letting the swing pass over his head, then drove his shoulder into the scout's chest. They both hit the ground hard. The enemy's weapon skidded away on the rocky surface. Kalen pulled his sidearm and fired point blank. The fight ended as suddenly as it began, the noise replaced by the distant hiss of the wind through the hills. The princess lowered her sword, her chest rising and falling quickly. She glanced at the bodies, then at Kalen, her gaze unreadable. He checked his rifle, reloaded, and gestured toward the ridge they had been aiming for. She nodded once, then began walking again. Her steps were steady, but Kalen could see the stiffness in her injured arm. He kept his pace matched to hers, scanning the terrain for movement. As they moved deeper into the hills, the ground became more uneven. Sharp crystal shards jutted from the soil like broken teeth. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, mixed with the distant smell of burning. Kalen wondered if the war had already reached the other side of the ridge. The princess moved as if she knew every stone and shadow. Her focus locked on the path ahead. They reached a shallow ravine and slid down its side. The floor was scattered with the remains of old campfires, long abandoned. Kalen crouched beside one, feeling the ash crumble under his fingers. These fires were not recent, but they marked a route once used by travelers or scouts. The princess stopped near a flat stone, brushing her fingers over carved symbols. Her face tightened, and she spoke softly, almost to herself. Kalen stepped closer, studying the markings. He could not read them, but he recognized the pattern warning signs. She looked at him, then pointed to her wound and to the ground ahead. The message was clear. This place was dangerous, and in her condition, any new fight would be harder. Kalen adjusted the strap on his rifle and signaled for them to keep moving. Knowing that stopping would only invite trouble, the ravine narrowed until they had to walk single file. The walls closed in, blocking the wind and trapping the heat. Each step felt heavier. Kalen noticed faint grooves in the stone, as if something massive had passed through here many times. The princess kept her hand near her sword, her eyes scanning the shadows above. Every sound seemed louder in the confined space, from the crunch of gravel to the distant crack of shifting rock. A sudden rumble echoed from ahead. Kalen raised his rifle, and the princess froze. From around the bend, a towering figure emerged, taller than the giant they had fought before. Its armor was dark and uneven, built from plates of scavenged metal. The creature's eyes glowed faintly, and in its hands it carried a massive hammer that looked capable of shattering stone. It moved slowly, but each step shook the ground under their feet. The princess stepped forward, her voice sharp as she called out in her language. The creature stopped, tilting its head as if recognizing her. Kalen stayed ready to fire, unsure whether this was an enemy or something worse. The princess glanced back at him, then took another step forward, lowering her sword slightly. Whatever was about to happen, it would decide whether they survived this stretch of the journey or died. In the shadows of the ravine, the towering creature's gaze shifted between the princess and Kalen. Its grip on the massive hammer tightened, the metal edges catching the dim light. Kalen kept his rifle trained on its chest, ready to fire if it made a move. The princess spoke again, her words sharp and deliberate. This time, the creature tilted its head further, as though her voice stirred some memory buried deep in its mind. It lowered the hammer slightly, the weight making a dull thud against the ground. The princess took another step closer, her hand still resting on the hilt of her sword. Kalen did not lower his weapon, but he watched the tension in the creature's shoulders ease. A low, rumbling sound came from its chest, almost like speech but too distorted for him to understand. The princess responded calmly, her tone steady and without fear. After a pause, the creature turned and began walking down the ravine. It looked back once, as if inviting them to follow. The princess glanced at Kalen and gave a small nod. He hesitated, but the choice was clear: either follow this strange guide or face whatever danger still hunted them from behind. He moved in after her, his senses sharp for any sign of betrayal. The path widened as they followed the creature. The walls of the ravine gave way to an open basin dotted with jagged crystal spires. The air here was warmer, carrying the faint scent of oil and smoke. Small fires burned in stone pits along the edges, and Kalen noticed the shapes of other figures moving in the shadows. They were smaller than the creature, but wore similar patchwork armor. It was a camp, hidden deep within the hills. The princess stopped at the center of the basin. Several armored figures approached, their weapons held low but ready. They spoke in the same guttural tone as the creature, their eyes flicking between her and Kalen. She answered with firm, commanding words. The murmurs among them grew quieter, replaced by focused listening. Kalen realized she was not pleading for safety, she was giving orders, and they were listening. One of the smaller figures brought a shallow bowl filled with dark liquid. The princess took it without hesitation and drank. Then she held it out toward Kalen. He looked at it, uncertain. but her steady gaze told him it was important. He drank, the taste bitter and metallic. The camp's murmurs shifted again, and Kalen saw the way their eyes followed him now. Whatever this ritual was, it had marked him as something more than an outsider. The towering creature returned, this time carrying a bundle wrapped in black cloth. It knelt before the princess and unwrapped the bundle to reveal a weapon unlike any Kalen had seen. It was a long spear with a crystal blade that glowed faintly in the dark. The princess placed her hand on it, then pushed it toward Kalen. His first instinct was to refuse. This felt like an honor meant for someone else. But her eyes left no room for argument. When he took the spear, the camp fell silent. The princess spoke again, her voice carrying through the basin. Though Kalen could not understand her words, he felt their weight. She was declaring him as something, perhaps an ally, perhaps a champion. The towering creature stepped back, its massive head bowing slightly in his direction. For the first time since the battle began, Kalen felt the shift of momentum on their side. The moment was cut short by a loud, distant roar. It was the giant from before, and his voice carried over the hills like a warning. The camp erupted into movement, warriors grabbing weapons and forming lines. The princess's eyes locked on Kalen's, and she pointed toward the ridge beyond. The basin. Whatever safety they had found here would not last. The fight was coming for them again, and they had to be ready. War cries rolled across the basin as the hidden camp formed a shield around the princess and Kalen. Fires were stamped out, and oil pots were dragged to the rim of the rocks. The towering creature thumped its hammer twice, and the smaller warriors moved like a single body. Kalen tested the weight of the crystal spear and felt a faint thrum in his hands. The princess touched his wrist and met his eyes with a steady, fearless look. She spoke to the warriors in a clear voice that carried to the far edges of the basin. Kalen did not know the words, but he heard duty and promise in her tone. The camp answered with a sharp chant that rose and fell like the beat of a drum. She turned to Kalen and drew a quick shape on his chest with one finger, leaving a pale mark that glowed for a heartbeat. It was a sign of trust and a seal of command. Scouts slid down the ravine with urgent news. The giant had split his force and was pushing from two sides at once. Kalen saw the map drawn in dust and understood the trap. If they waited, the camp would be crushed. He pointed to the narrower pass on the south rim and shaped a simple plan with gestures. The princess watched, then nodded once and added a counterstroke with her own signals. Together they chose the ground where numbers would matter least. They moved fast, climbing the broken ridge while the camp reformed behind them. Oil pots were placed above the choke point. Spiked stones were wedged into cracks to roll at the right moment. The towering creature took position in the center like a gate. Kalen and the princess stood forward of the line, where the mouth of the pass funneled any attacker into a blade's width. Wind hissed through the rocks and distant armor clattered like rain on iron. The first wave came in a rush. Dark armored troops drove into the pass with shields high. Kalen planted the spear and thrust at the lead shield, the crystal edge slicing through the metal with a clean bite. The princess stepped past him and cut low, turning the tight ground into her ally. A pot shattered from above and spilled fire along the stones. The attackers faltered as heat and smoke surged upward in a blinding wall of light. A second wave tried to climb the side walls, but the spiked stones broke their grip. The towering creature swung its hammer once and crushed a platform of rock under three climbers. Kalen shifted left to cover a gap and felt the spear pull toward a strike as if it knew the moment before he did. He followed the pull and dropped an enemy who had slipped past the flame. The princess caught another blade on the flat of her sword and answered with a precise cut. A heavy tremor rolled under their boots, and the smoke parted as the giant advanced. His armor was marked by their first battle, but his stride had not slowed. He lifted his curved blade and pointed it at the princess, then at Kalen, making the same cruel promise he had made before. The camp line steadied behind them as if bracing against a storm. Kalen felt fear rise like cold water, then felt it burn away under the steady heat of purpose. The giant charged, and Kalen met him half a step early to break the rhythm. The spear flashed, struck the wrist guard, and sparked bright. The princess slid to the giant's blind side and drove her blade into a seam near the hip. The blow staggered him, and the camp roared as if pushing him with sound alone. He recovered and swept his blade in a brutal arc, but Kalen dropped beneath it and surged up, driving the spear into the gap beneath the ribs. Metal screamed as the crystal point bit deep. The giant slammed a gauntlet into Kalen's shoulder and hurled him back. The world tilted, then steadied as the princess stepped through the opening his strike had made. Her sword rose and fell with clean, hard finality. The giant swayed, tried to lift his blade again, and failed. He sank to one knee, then to the stone, and the pass went silent except for the crackle of dying fire and the rush of evening wind. The enemy line hesitated, then broke. Some fled into the hills, and some threw down their weapons and knelt. The camp did not chase, and the towering creature raised its hammer to mark the fight's end. Kalen stood with the spear planted in the rock and drew one long breath as the ache in his shoulder settled. The princess faced the camp and lifted her sword in salute, then turned to Kalen and gave him the smallest, proudest nod he had ever seen. The camp gathered in a wide circle around the fallen giant's body. Fires burned higher now, casting long shadows against the basin walls. The towering creature stood guard beside the princess while Kalen leaned on the spear, catching his breath. He felt every muscle in his body ache, but the sight of the enemy retreating made the pain bearable. The princess's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for signs that the danger was truly gone. When none came, she stepped forward and placed her sword tip against the stone in a formal gesture. The warriors of the camp bowed their heads in silence, honoring both the dead and the victory. Kalen copied the gesture, unsure of its meaning but feeling its weight. The princess glanced at him once, a brief flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. In that moment, he understood he was no longer just a stranger in her fight. They carried the giant's body to the edge of the basin and set it on a pyre of crystal and oil-soaked cloth. The flames roared to life, sending bright sparks into the night sky. The princess spoke words Kalen could not follow, but her voice carried the strength of command and the tone of mourning. When she finished, the towering creature struck the ground with its hammer, and the sound echoed through the hills like a closing chapter. Food was brought out, simple but filling. Kalen ate quickly, his mind still restless from the fight. He kept watching the edges of the camp, expecting another attack, but none came. The princess sat with a small group of her closest fighters, speaking quietly while they patched their armor and cleaned their weapons. Every so often, her gaze would lift toward Kalen, as if weighing some decision in her mind. When the meal ended, she rose and walked toward him. The camp fell quiet as she stopped a few steps away. Without speaking, she took his hand and led him to the center of the basin. There, the towering creature waited with a folded cloth bundle. The princess took it and unwrapped it, revealing a narrow metal band shaped to fit around a wrist. She slid it onto Kalen's arm, the cool metal warming instantly against his skin. A murmur spread through the camp. The princess raised her voice and declared something with firm authority. The warriors responded with a unified chant, their voices bouncing off the rock walls. Kalen did not need a translation to know that this was an oath binding. Whatever it meant in their culture, it tied his fate to hers in front of every witness. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders, heavy but unshakable. Night deepened, and the fires burned low. Most of the warriors slept in shifts, but Kalen and the princess remained awake. She walked with him along the basin's edge, pointing out constellations in the alien sky. Her voice was softer now, the tension of the day giving way to a quiet steadiness. Kaelin listened, not to the words, but to the rhythm, finding it strangely calming after so much chaos. At the far side of the basin, they stopped near a narrow overlook. Below, the dark hills stretched endlessly, their shapes shifting in the wind. The princess rested her hand on the rock and looked out for a long moment. Then she turned to Kaelin and spoke a single word in his language champion. It was not shouted or formal, but given like a truth she had carried for some time. The sound of it settled deep in him like an anchor. They returned to the center of the camp, where the towering creature now stood alone. It handed Kaelin a long-wrapped object. Inside was a secondary weapon, a short, wide-bladed sword with the same faint crystal glow as the spear. The balance was perfect in his grip. The princess nodded to him, then to the creature, and they both stepped back. Kaelin understood without words that this gift meant he was ready for whatever came next. Dawn broke with a pale light spilling over the basin. The fires had burned low, leaving only glowing embers in the pits. Kaelin woke to the sound of distant horns, a deep, rolling call that sent ripples of unease through the camp. The princess was already awake, her armor cleaned and repaired, her sword strapped across her back. She met his gaze and spoke 2 words in her language. He could not translate them, but he knew they meant it was time. Warriors assembled quickly, their movements precise and silent. The towering creature stood at the front, its hammer resting across its shoulders. Kaelin adjusted the crystal spear in his grip, and felt the weight of the short sword at his side. The princess walked among her fighters, touching shoulders and meeting eyes with each one. When she passed Kaelin, her hand lingered a moment on his arm before she took her place at the head of the formation. They left the basin in a disciplined march, following a narrow trail through the jagged hills. The horns sounded again, closer now, and the wind carried the faint metallic scent of an advancing army. Kaelin could see dust rising beyond the ridge ahead. The princess raised her hand, and the line halted. Scouts slid forward and vanished. Between the rocks, the only sound was the low hum of tension hanging in morning air. Minutes later, the scouts returned with urgent gestures. The enemy had regrouped more than before, and they were coming straight for the ridge. The princess studied the terrain, her eyes moving quickly from stone outcrops to choke points. Kaelin stepped beside her and pointed to a narrow defile, flanked by sheer rock faces. She considered it, then nodded sharply. The warriors moved to position without a single wasted motion. The first enemy wave entered the defile with shields locked. Kaelin and the princess struck together, their weapons moving in perfect rhythm. The spear's crystal edge cut through armor while her sword swept low and fast. Above, the camp's warriors rained stones and fire from the ridges. The narrow pass became a trap, and the enemy's advance slowed under the relentless assault. Still, more kept coming, their determination unbroken. Kaelin felt the press of bodies against his shield and pushed back hard. The princess leaped onto a rock and drove her blade down into an exposed helm. The towering creature slammed its hammer into the ground, sending shockwaves through the enemy ranks. The defile became a chaos of sound steel ringing, fire crackling, and warriors shouting. Kaelin kept his focus narrow, striking only when an opening was sure. A deep roar cut through the noise, and the enemy ranks split. From the rear came a new figure, larger than the giant they had faced before, clad in blackened armor that absorbed the light. In its hands was a weapon unlike any Kaelin had seen, a massive axe with twin blades glowing red. The warriors nearest it faltered, and Kaelin felt the shift in the fight's momentum. The princess jumped down from the rock and moved toward it without hesitation. Kaelin followed, the spear steady in his hands. The towering figure swung its axe in a wide arc, forcing them apart. The princess rolled under the strike and slashed at the enemy's side, leaving a deep cut in the armor. Kaelin drove the spear forward, aiming for the gap she had made. The enemy staggered but did not fall. It turned with sudden speed and caught Kalen with the side of the axe, sending him to one knee. The princess moved between them, blocking another swing with her sword. The impact sent cracks through the blade, but she held her ground. Kalen rose, pain burning in his side, and drove the spear upward into the figure's chest. The crystal flared with blinding light as it pierced through. The enemy froze, the glow of its weapon fading. The princess stepped in and finished the strike, bringing the figure crashing to the ground. Silence fell over the defile. The enemy soldiers dropped their weapons and fled, their will to fight broken. The princess stood still for a moment, then turned to Kalen. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head. The warriors of the camp followed her lead, their voices rising in a chant that filled the air. Kalen understood that this was not just victory, it was the end of the war for her people, and the bond they had forged would never be broken.